Welcome to the final panel of the Decarbonisation Summit 2021, and this afternoon's panel focuses on another key sector for decarbonisation, that of international travel and transport. Air travel and shipping are major emitters, and in the case of international air travel, the technological answers are not perhaps entirely yet known. So this panel will address that key challenge and dive into the possible solutions. So let me introduce our panel of experts on the present and future methods of travel and transport, and they are Aman Pannu, Global Practice Area Leader for Aerospace and Defence at Frost & Sullivan. Aman's role is instrumental in ensuring that the aerospace sector is granted the funding to develop and adapt sustainably. Charlie Simpson, UK Ireland Lead for Aerospace and Defence at EY Parthenon, advising corporate clients and investors, as well as government departments, on building a greener transport and energy world. Duncan Hopkins, Head of Asset Management and Customer Experience at Urban Airport. Marcel Fujike, Global Head of Products and Services in Air Logistics at Kuehne+Nagel, driving the development and global implementation of air logistics solutions and air freight transport initiatives. And lastly, Sonya Kerr, Head of Marketing and Strategic Communications at Catagen, a tech startup developing new innovations and products that take our society beyond now. And she has some very good news on some significant funding today, which we'll hear about shortly. So let's first understand a little bit more about the work that they do. And if you could first of all give us a sense of what you're doing in your businesses to decarbonise. Just a couple of minutes, please. Marcel, what's Kuehne+Nagel doing to decarbonise?
Ladies first, huh?
Well, ladies first. Okay. Sonya, tell us more about your news and what you're doing to decarbonise.
Sure. So Catagen's core business is to provide emissions testing to the global automotive sector. So we've been helping them meet emissions standards globally, really from about 2010. Not only meet them, but surpass them with patented technology. We're a spin out of Queen's University. However, our vision is to clean and decarbonise the air. That patented technology, we can use it to create green hydrogen and also to create an e-fuel hydrogen carrier that could be used in aviation and marine. Those are very, very new technologies for us, and we just heard today that we got some funding from BASE to do feasibility studies for green hydrogen and the e-fuel carrier. We are also working on a piece of software for citizens to help them understand their own transport emissions, so they know how much carbon they know to displace, or when's the right time, for example, to buy an electric vehicle or move to hydrogen as well. And we're also powered 100% by renewable energy, so we do not test on engines, and we've displaced 1,100 tonnes of carbon to date.
Go to the top of the class, Sonya. Excellent, excellent work. Marcel, tell us about the work that Kuehne+Nagel are doing to decarbonise.
Sure. So Kuehne+Nagel, for those of you who are not aware of, is one of the largest logistics providers globally. We're doing air freight, sea freight, contract logistics, and overland, which is rail and road. We set ourselves the target in 2019 that by end of 2020, we are Scope 1 and 2 net zero carbon, and by 2030, Scope 3. And we're now looking into our business unit Air Logistics. We have to say that 97% of our carbon emissions are coming from the pure flight movement. So that is basically what we're concentrating on. To give you the figure, we are burning roughly 40 million liters of kerosene per week to transport the goods of our clients. So that is for us the major challenge when we're looking into decarbonization. As Sonya mentioned, for us it's pretty important, of course, knowing what emissions do we produce and where and with whom. So visibility and then the target is quite important. So we joined the Science Based Target Initiative last year, and a clear route towards 2030 and what do we want to achieve and what can we still achieve. We are focusing a lot on avoidance and reduction, and that is a bit of the short-term things you can easily achieve, like lighter packaging, lighter containers. We exchange plastic wraps around our pallets that we are using. They are now biodegradable. We are consulting clients on better routes they can take, or other airlines that have more efficient aircraft, so producing less emissions. And of course, offsetting for us is still a topic, because, and I think that we will discuss later on as well, with all the good things about biofuel or sustainable aviation fuel being around, still we cannot decarbonize 100%. at the moment, so we need the offsetting as well. And as mentioned, the largest portion in our work is looking into really getting the emissions of a flight down. And in that, we are concentrating heavily on sustainable aviation fuel. So we bought already, as the largest commitment of any freight forwarder in the world, almost 13 million liters of SAF this year that we are now offering to our customers as well. So we are trying to more or less move customers into the game as well. And we're looking into alternative modes of transportation, like moving more stuff from air to a sea-air or air-sea combination, or looking into innovative transportation modes like drones or airships.
Very good. So as a major global business, these measures should hopefully have a pretty significant decarbonisation impact. So thank you very much for that. Duncan, tell us a little bit about your work on the decarbonisation side, please.
At Urban Airport, we're focusing on creating the infrastructure required to support zero carbon air mobility solutions, exactly like what we're mentioning there. We're building the world's first vertiport in Coventry early next year in April, where we will be demonstrating live flights of logistics drones, where we see our infrastructure supporting communities and drone operators is around providing that final mile logistics solution for a lot of the transport that we're seeing at the moment in white vans that are clogging up our cities. And as the technology develops further, we're able to provide the infrastructure required for passenger eVTOLs that are electric vertical takeoff landing vehicles that we'll see fairly soon, sooner than a lot of people think. We're also working on a patented logistics-specific drone port, which is a modular solution that can handle multiple drones at one time. We're UK government backed, and we're also backed by Hyundai, our strategic partner, the world's fifth largest car manufacturer. So we're very much at the forefront where a lot of people at the moment are talking about the solutions and the technologies that we need. We're actually building it now, and making sure that all of these OEMs and developers that are making the drones and eVTOLs have the infrastructure that they need going forward to deliver these services.
Thank you very much. Charlie, over to you at EY. I know a little bit about EY. Obviously, you're a consulting firm advising other companies on their decarbonisation plans, but I know that you're doing some great work yourselves, for example, on the electric car front with, I think, your Belgian office going over to EVs. Tell us a little bit more about the wider plans within EY to decarbonise, please.
You're right, Ed. As a professional services company, clearly we're not manufacturing product ourselves. But there's probably two lenses. One is the way we as EY have reduced our own carbon footprint. And you mentioned the encouraging our staff to switch to EVs, which is clearly one initiative. I think from my perspective, more dramatically, certainly over the last 2 years and as a result of COVID, our emission footprint through reduced business travel has been dramatic. Now, that was not all intended, but it's thrown up some very interesting shifts in operating behaviour. And we may want to come back to that in terms of which elements of business travel either will come back or won't. And I think there's been some fairly fundamental shifts there. In terms of the day job, clearly we advise clients across a fairly broad range of spectrums. So from the OEM car companies to the airline and airframers. We do a lot of work with the energy companies, with technology and with finance. And I think a couple of strands to pick up on. Clearly, the move towards electrification, particularly the electrification of commercial fleets, is a significant theme at the moment. And that's both from the OEM's point of views, understanding how their business models evolve over the next 5, 10, 20 years, is a key theme. Clearly, the end users of fleets, whether it's the likes of supermarket delivery fleets, logistics, post office type operations, or other delivery organizations, are having to make some really tough choices in terms of the speed and the nature of that transition. And we're really helping them think through the timing, the implications, and managing the risks. And then coming down, probably more specifically, the topic of emissions management and emissions control, particularly for our clients in upstream, midstream, oil and gas, taking technologies from the energy sector and then rolling that into adjacent sectors with heavy emissions footprints is a particularly hot topic. And I think from EY's point of view, probably two cross-cutting strands that link these themes together. One is the financing of this transition. Clearly, the scale of that has been a big topic over this week, but really managing the scale, the deployment, and the risk as these projects emerge is one key theme for us. And then the second one is probably the data architecture and the technologies that are emerging to enable these transitions. So that's really the internal and the external lens, but probably some topics we can come back to later in the conversation.
Thanks so much indeed, Charlie. So lastly, Aman, over to you at Frost & Sullivan. Tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing over at Frost & Sullivan to decarbonise within your business, please.
Yeah, like that. So from Frost & Sullivan's perspective, it's quite similar to what Charlie was talking about. Our own kind of footprint in terms of how we interact with our customers is drastically reduced, right? I'm spending a lot more time. I'm getting better at lighting, as you can see, working on the Zoom platform. But what we are doing is, from a customer perspective, is we have created ourselves as an information and collaboration hub. Information which is data enriched and helps the customers to really be informed about where the sector stands today and what they need to do and what they can do in terms of achieving some of the targets and ambitions that have been set forth at a policy level, sometimes at an industry level. Collaboration, well, it has to be both horizontal and vertical in nature. And more what we're observing is that the change has to be at grassroots levels. So there are quite a few kind of tier one and kind of OEMs where there are a lot of initiatives in the positive direction taking. But at the same time, if things are to really change drastically, so for us to really go beyond the targets that have been mandated onto us to really make a dent on the situation we are in currently. So we'll really have to address it at an SME level, at a process level. So that's what we kind of actively engage with our customers and advise them in terms of what are their options, what is data indicating, where is it heading, but also highlight some cross-industry best practices, because we're talking aviation and transport here, but there's so many best practices you can take from other kind of high safety, high risk kind of operational industries, which can be brought in also. So that collaboration is absolute key right across the board for all of us if we want to really achieve the targets we are setting for ourselves here.
Thank you very much indeed, Aman. So let's fly right into our first set of questions then, starting off with technology and some of the challenges there. So in many cases, the technologies are either nascent or really not yet there in terms of being able to be delivered. So, for example, with hydrogen or with electrification of aircraft, is that a problem, particularly in relation to the need for speed in the transition to zero emissions international travel? Would you like to maybe have a go at that one first?
Yeah, I think infrastructure and funding plays a big part of this. We're a small innovative technology company, 19 people. So the funding that we got from BEIS will allow us to move forward with their 2 projects. However, we could move faster as we develop those out. And I'm sure it's the same for everyone here today. The infrastructure to do this, if you talk about hydrogen fuel cells, charging points, there's only 400 of those globally, compared to over 200,000 electric vehicle charging points. And that's okay. Moving to EV is definitely the future for auto. However, for the likes of heavy duty vehicles, buses, aviation, marine, there has to be other options like hydrogen and e-fuels. So it's a blended solution. We feel e-fuels will come into its own after 2030. We feel green hydrogen will really be in place from 2040 onwards. So hitting the 2050 sort of deadline for net zero.
Marcel, you've said that Kuehne+Nagel does need to still look at carbon offsetting, which indicates that perhaps the technologies aren't there to fully decarbonise. Is that your sense of things?
I would say that the technologies are there right now. So even today, we have the biosaf, so the biological sustainable aviation fuel, which is made out of tallow, so the slaughtering waste of cattle, or used cooking oils. We know that this biofuel is not sufficient in quantity to really fuel the entire aviation industry. But on the other way, the technology is there. Demand at the moment is not sufficient, so there is more SAF available that we could source than we really need, or demand is there. So I basically echo what you are saying. I think the technology is there. We just need to have more policies in place that are subsidizing or incentivizing the use of SAF, because if I compare the SAF price or the premium to the normal fossil jet fuel kerosene, I mean, it's very, very expensive, and we have huge interest from a lot of customers. So hundreds of customers are approaching us, I would say, every month. But whenever they hear the price difference, I mean, we lose 95% of them immediately. So, and that's what needs to change.
So to clarify, your customers are coming to you saying, what's the sustainable transport solution?
Yes, they heard about SAF. They would love to do something. They don't want to do offset because they really want to avoid carbon emissions.
Yep.
But we are then coming forward saying, okay, for the time being, until hydrogen aircrafts or whatever hits the market, it's another 10, 15 years to go. I mean, this 10, 15, 20 years most probably we need to cover with SAF. That's a fact. And this SAF needs to conquer the market and needs to be our weapon against carbon emissions.
Perhaps this is a case of, the technologies are out there, they're just unevenly distributed at the moment. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, it's absolutely that. I completely agree with Sonya and Marcel's points that it's around infrastructure and it's around investment in the infrastructure. We can just look at the electric vehicle market in the UK and how much more accelerated the uptake would have been if we'd been where we are with our charging infrastructure at the same pace that the OEMs were developing the vehicles. We're seeing the same now with the OEMs we're working with on future air mobility solutions. So we're really proud to be working with the UK government and UK Innovation as part of Future Flight Phase 2 to be demonstrating this capability. We'll have a hydrogen fuel cell at our site in Coventry next year. But again, it's making sure that the pace of investment in the required infrastructure to support these changes happens quickly enough. And I think there's a piece there at local level as well for local authorities around their transport master planning. To have an awareness of the impact of both air and ground-based requirements for future EV methods. There's a combination of, obviously Marcel's business deals with the global element, but everything in that supply chain comes down to that final mile. What we're trying to do is develop intermodal local hubs that you can connect multiple different types of EVs as charging solution. So that final mile, whether it's a person or whether it's a package being delivered, can be done on an electric bicycle or a scooter, having come from an urban air method that reduces the impact on the actual road networks as well.
I'm a huge fan of the e-bike, the underrated electric vehicle, and the electric vehicle that has the fastest consumer take-up, right? So, Charlie, over to you at EY. What's your sense of this technology piece in terms of the availability of the technologies and the rate of change needed?
Yeah, I think some of the technology points have been covered. I think that the piece that interests us is the degree of coordination that's going to be required at a systems level to accelerate the transition. As was pointed out, the OEMs have eventually started to move at scale. And I think when you look at the adoption of any of these technologies, be it the fuels or the charging infrastructure, it's once we start seeing scale predictability, and particularly predictability around technology standards. These are the things that are going to be helping de-risk this from the point of view of investors. And similar to the story in terms of customers being interested in fuels up to the point where they see the price point, almost the inverse that we're seeing is from an investor lens point of view, is where there's huge amounts of pent-up capital looking to deploy at scale. But the reality at this point is in many of these areas, the project size is relatively small. Clearly, they're less mature technologies. Therefore, you've got a different risk profile. And I think from our point of view, one of the de-risking mechanisms is the critical role that government has to play in terms of laying out some of the rules of the road standards and the commitments over the long term, be it around green hydrogen or other aspects of the technology. And we think it's when that starts kicking in, large-scale investors, particularly the global pension funds, the infrastructure funds, will start feeling more able to deploy the dry powder capital that is available. I guess the challenge with this is that we're asking for a coordination between OEMs, fuel companies, technology companies, and governments to coordinate around route plans that they've never really had to do previously. And I think this for us is one of the big unblockers. We're seeing some positive signs, but there's still a long way to go on that.
Do you get a sense that this last week, coming up to 2 weeks now at COP26, has helped with the focus on decarbonisation? Do you think that's helped to de-risk the sense of investment in this sector?
Our view would be a cautiously positive step forward, but still a lot more to do. This is baby steps at this stage. And we think, particularly from a UK government point of view, again, some encouraging first steps, but our view is that the scale of this transition, and particularly the speed at which this is going to have to move, hasn't fully been appreciated yet. So we give it cautious encouragement, but a lot more to go.
Yep, certainly. So Aman, over to you. What's your take on this question?
Yeah, without risking to repeat quite a few of the things, I think from a technology perspective, there's quite a bit of progress that is being made. The challenge is we are talking, let's say, aviation as a sector, which is a heavily regulated sector. You could have the technology ready today and you still couldn't field it for another 5 years unless you got it fully certified, etc., and for the right reasons. So that actually drives that necessity of the collaboration where the regulators, the industry, the SME, and the customer have to come together at very early stages. And we are seeing the right kind of movements happening in the sector. So that's why, you see some of the announcements going as aggressive as 2030, we're going to get some first kind of hydrogen-powered aircraft flying around, etc. Those are really coming in because of that collaborative kind of view to technology, which was just about 5 years back or even 3 years back not existing. So that's absolutely kind of a crucial element. What I believe is a bit missing as of now in terms of all the targets, etc., and the ambitions that have been kind of put forth, 2050, net zero, etc., is that you got to start translating these into outcome-based KPIs for the industry and the various stakeholders who are involved in it. Okay? Now, the moment that happens, you will see an absolute cultural change, a cultural change that will happen not only in terms of the design stages, and a big kind of push that we are trying to put forth with the industry is to start talking about net zero by design. Okay, so that kind of element from an industry perspective, but also from a regulator as well as from a customer perspective. So why not, take these outcomes and define them in such a way that, the customers who are going to be acquiring these technologies to deliver the services and capabilities for their passengers, their customers, are driven by and incentivized as well as penalized for choosing the right technologies, which contribute towards the environmental goals. So those elements still need to be weaved in and brought out quite clearly so that from that point onwards, everyone can start working backwards to how to achieve it.
Interesting stuff. So if, coming back to your point, Charlie, on COP26 not perhaps being the most positive catalyst for change, if we look back at the last 18 months and the COVID time period of that change, I mean, it taught us that change itself was possible on a pretty profound scale, and obviously it's had a huge impact on international travel, both air travel and shipping. What's your sense of what the last 18 months has taught us, Sonya, in terms of that position piece and the change that follows from it?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about the race to net zero at Catagen, and we feel that race should be as fast as the COVID vaccine race. We are in a race globally in this sector, whether it's for green hydrogen, electrification. The world is here right now. Coming out of COVID, I think we're in a very lucky position. We're all Zoomed, Microsoft Teams out, but actually the hybrid level of working is now just taken for granted. So you don't need necessarily to fly to the US or China or across Europe anymore. You can do business very, very effectively. So I think it's having the right policies in place and being really considered from a company's approach, but also then as a company we are displacing our carbon for our flights, and it would be interesting to hear if other companies are doing that. So I think the technology's there. I've worked in the software industry as well. The Zooms, Microsoft Teams are there. Use those technologies as much as possible. But with the face-to-face is really important, so people will still have to fly. They still have to travel, and that's really important. But to be mindful of that, we're developing, as I say, a bit of software so people can really understand their carbon transport emissions, so they can actively make decisions about what they want to do about that, whether they don't take the car to work, they take the train, the bus, the cycle, walk. You know, if they decide to holiday 2 or 3 times a year, do they do that in a different way? You know, do they take a longer holiday and do 1 flight, 2 flights rather than 4 sets of flights? But it really, today, people don't really understand their own transport carbon emissions. The average person, each year, it's 10 tonnes of carbon. The government would like us to get that down to 2.5 tonnes. The only way we can do that is through moving to electric vehicle, reducing our home heating or changing our home heating to heat pumps or hydrogen. So the world is massively disrupting, and I don't really think the normal person maybe out in the street really understands that, but it's coming, and it's going to be here by 2030 when we all can't buy new petrol or diesel cars. I think that's something that people really need to consider in their buying habits moving forward.
Marcel at Kuehne+Nagel, do you think the last 18 months, that COVID period of time has been a really instrumental and pivotal moment for change within your business?
Well, I can only echo what Sonya was saying, actually. So I think it basically showed us that the logistics industry is a crucial industry for global, well, let's say, survival. And we are quite resilient, and we are able to find solutions. And that solutions were all around the collaboration or cooperation area, I would say. I think when it comes to other tools or relinking suppliers or partners into our system, then there were not more or other ideas than we had before. It was kind of that certain things got accelerated maybe because there was just a need for, and others got delayed because you can feel as well, and as Sonya mentioned as well, there is sometimes it's beneficial to meet face to face, and we had partners that were maybe not set up in that nice virtual way that we were, and they struggled in really delivering timelines. So I think that is what happened on our side. When I now look into is business travel coming back, I fully agree here as well. I think 60% we say of our trips are gone. They will not come back. I foresee that maybe whenever the borders are opening up again, they will have some peak first. I need to see my counterpart again, and then most probably it comes to a new normal that is then phasing out again.
Mm-hmm. And Duncan, do you think the last 18 months have been a pivotal moment for change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're a relatively new startup, born out of the lockdown period as well, which is it's a really important piece about how we're now used to Zoom meetings. When I joined Urban Airport earlier this year, for quite a few, we're dispersed around the UK and Europe. So, my first introduction to a lot of colleagues face-to-face was quite a few months down the line, but that was normal for us. I think Sonya makes a really important point about our personal awareness, about our carbon footprint. And that is linked a lot to COVID because a lot of people have moved back to working from home and that hybrid model, which has put a bigger dependency on the local logistics requirement. So coming back to the city box model we're delivering for that final mile delivery of packages, who wouldn't be happy to give up 2 car parking spaces in their street, meaning that then the carbon reduction of vehicles being driven, the carbon emitting vehicles now don't need to come into that urban area. But I think there's another piece which links into a point Marcel made, I think in the previous question, about when you have clients come in asking around greener fuel options and they find out the price and they're turned off. I think it's incumbent on big business and big government around procurement strategies that should be a measurement when they're tendering supply chain options, you know, it's great to talk about the final mile, but the entire footprint, you know, right from factory to delivery point, that's a level that needs to be assessed and considered, I think.
Very good. Over to the analysts. Charlie, what's your sense of the last 18 months as a catalyst for change?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo some of the points. I mean, the piece we are seeing most dramatically being a global services company, and speaking personally, I've spent the large part of 25 years on a plane pretty much every other week. That world will never come back. I agree there'll probably maybe a residual 20 to 30% that does at some point, but I guess I'd say a couple of observations from that. One is, as professional services companies, we and our clients have had something of a financial re-engineering reality around this, that running big global services projects had a very large travel budget attached to it. That can now be deployed, frankly, more usefully from both us and our clients' point of view. So it's not only the lack of willingness to travel, it's the actual economic flexibility and, frankly, additional profitability that's generated. If you're sitting in the airlines, that's clearly you're on the wrong side or the negative side of that equation. I think then you overlay the fact that the technology works and it's embedded new ways of working is more of a functional point. But I think linking it back to the overall theme of the debate, for me, it illustrates the speed and the scale of change that we can make when a combination of carrot and sticks are enforced. So I think for me, there's a really interesting analogy that we can take forward into the decarbonisation debate. But I'd also pick up on from the carrot and stick point of view, tax incentivization and disincentivization. Now, in principle, I think people can see the logic and the direction of travel. The interesting thing is when you start looking at some of the tipping points. So if you look at this from an automotive perspective in UK Treasury, where something in the order of 28 billion of road fuel duty is still being very heavily relied on by Treasury, depending on the acceleration curves towards EV, at what point do we either move towards a hybrid or a switched taxation policy where we can't really tax electrons in the same way that we did litres of fuel? We then start moving to more usage-based taxation patterns. And those mechanisms and those shifts are both technologically but also politically very challenging. Again, it requires a level of coordination. And I think as somebody raised a very good point, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking supply side and technology. But at the end of the day, we as consumers have got to be buying into this change as well. We at EY have run a piece of research recently called the Mobility Consumer Index. And that's thrown up some really interesting insights in terms of how consumers' willingness to consider electric vehicles, as an example, has risen fairly dramatically over the last 2 years. So I think these are a combination of coordinated steps, some of them designed, some more by happen chance. So on average, I'm positive, but again, I do come back to the key role that government's going to play in terms of laying out consistently some of the rules of the road.
We discussed carrots at some length this morning in the food and agriculture panel, so I'll leave that to one side. I'd like to come on to some of the taxation sticks in a subsequent question, but Aman, lastly over to you on this point, please.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in a slightly different kind of perspective. Firstly, everything that everyone is saying, I kind of agree with it. But if we go back a bit to the post kind of 9/11 scenario where the skyscrapers were basically, that was the end of skyscrapers meant to be. And then we fast forward 2 decades down the line, they've had probably some of the fastest growth in terms of coming together. What I want to focus on is that we as humans have a short-term memory towards actions that we take. Now the pandemic has been, you can't kind of directly equate it with the 9/11 incident. It's more global, it's much protracted in terms of the time frame and people who have got affected. But for us to make sure that this doesn't lead to short-termism, we will have to come to everything that we are talking about, which is really go from the grassroots levels to right to the customer and create incentive plans and penalty plans, which encourage people to actually make the right investments in their acquisition that they do and how they take the service to the end customers at their end. So again, that kind of refresh on an ongoing basis can only happen when there is much more clarity in terms of these kind of further down the road, 2030, 2050 kind of goals we have. How do they translate at an individual entity and individual level in our day-to-day transactions? And that is quite crucially, I think, is still missing. And there needs to be much better work that needs to be done in that kind of area.
So I mentioned the taxation piece. Earlier this year, the world's shipping companies actually asked global governments to put a tax on its carbon emissions. Would you welcome that? Would you like to see that extended to the air travel sector? I mean, it's just been instituted on a global level for the global financial technology community. Marcel, what's your sense of that from a Kuehne+Nagel perspective?
I think it could only be one measure, because at the end, you're only healing what you produced, and you're not really going to the root of this. So what we need to achieve is an avoidance of carbon emissions first, and that is more important. So whenever you tax carbon emissions on the air side, I would see as well that these carbon emissions or these taxation that needs to fully move into an incentivization or subsidizing of sustainable aviation fuels, which are really avoiding or reducing the carbon footprint. Otherwise, it will always be a simple calculation of how much is this tax costing me, and is that still cheaper than investing into sustainable aviation fuel? And if it is, I just go the easier route. That is normally what our industry is doing. So
I'll take that as a no. Sonya, your take on that?
I think it's a tricky one. I think I agree with Marcel. It should be about avoidance. It just happened, I'm watching a shot with my 12-year-old son last night, and when you actually think about the amount of recycling we send as freight halfway around the world to then get cheap clothing, I was listening to the last debate, sent back in freight, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong about that. So I don't think taxation would solve that problem. I think, you know, back to that regulatory aspect of what is the right thing to do, but also behaviour change by everyone to really understand where things are coming from and if they want to make that purchase. So to me, there's two things. There's definitely a bit of regulation there, but also then behaviour change is going to play such a huge part in this moving forward. Sorry, not a straight answer.
Duncan, regulation or taxation?
I think it's, well, I'm going to be quite controversial. I think it's both. I agree passionately with Sonia's comment about we actually have to take personal responsibility. So there's a piece that's about the individual that says, just because I can click on that really big corporation website and it'll be delivered to my door tomorrow, and then I can click 12 hours later and a different van will deliver it to me tomorrow. And the last panel as well around fashion, a lot of what was being discussed about how things are used there. But I think the combination of incentivization and taxation, they've got to work hand in hand. And if we look at the situation this week and last week with COP and the things that are being discussed at the moment, quite frankly, I think we're too late in the day for taxation to be a debate that's too complicated. I think we're at a really critical point now. So if the infrastructure's in place that supports the emerging technologies that we need to reduce that reliance on carbon-based fuels, then yeah, I think there should be that taxation. And I would accept that personally on the end-to-end products that I want to use personally. And if I choose, whether in a personal capacity or in a business capacity, that I need to travel halfway around the world to see someone, I should be willing to as the last resort, pay a premium taxation on that, but it should be the attempt to eliminate it first. Yeah, maybe not as direct as I intended, but yeah, I hope the sentiment's there.
Charlie, over at EY, do you see your clients clamouring for a tax to be imposed on their activities in the shipping and air travel sector, or not?
I think you can fairly safely say not clamouring, but I think there's an interesting balance between everyone accepting the general direction of travel and the necessity, whilst not being particularly keen on it being employed or deployed into their sector immediately. And I think this is one of the arts of government and coordination of international tax activities, is to get a gradual transition which gets that right balance, again, of incentive and disincentive. But I think that there's some interesting political dimensions that, given the fragility of supply chains that we're seeing globally, and interestingly into the UK post-Brexit, there's a huge amount of fragility across a large number of sectors. And the additional political impact is in terms of the unequal impact as taxation policy is applied, be that to foodstuffs or international travel. The audience here clearly has one view of this, but I think as you look at the impact across broader populations of taxation policy to encourage the trend, that gets very tricky. Having said all of that, I think we are going to have to apply some shocks to the system, because if governments move at a traditional, relatively slow considered pace with this, we're going to really struggle to hit some of the targets. It's then a question of balancing shocks to the system with potentially redistribution to minimize the effects elsewhere. And again, these are decisions that can't be taken at an individual sector level. They're going to have to be taken to some extent at a national economic level. So yeah, real challenge for the politicians around this.
Aman, your take on this question, please.
Yeah, I have to say I'm going to change my card now, because the ULEZ effect came into effect recently. So, and I look at it in that correlation. So it's driving me to adopt better technology, which is better for the environment, etc. And it's almost a bit of a push that I needed probably to do that. But you got to bear in mind that, for some of the bigger businesses who are into logistics, etc., they may be able to absorb these costs. For smaller players, it could be really a big challenge. And that's quite similar in the maritime sector also. So you got to play it a bit sensitively, and politically, you have to be quite cautious in terms of rolling out something like this. So I think it is yet to play out, but what it may lead to even is, yes, on one side, it will push the industry to actually adopt and innovate more into innovative technologies. But at the same time, it might actually make the already quite challenging supply chain situation even worse, because some of the players just may not be able to sustain that. Okay, so we got to play that in a bit of a balance there. I think one of the points which was previously raised was in terms of behavioral kind of shift that happened. I think these kind of taxation and regulations both actually have an impact on that. They change how people think about, perceive, how they invest as a result of that, both in technology and services that they absorb in day-to-day life. And as such, I think the combined effect of that is going to have a net positive, but it still has to be quite cautiously rolled out.
Thank you very much. A question then from our online audience. A number of questions have come in from the online audience. Here's a tricky one. Can humanity afford to wait for green technology in aviation and shipping to become mainstream? Don't we need to decarbonise immediately? This person asks. We just heard today that some researchers come out saying that the commitments at COP26 have indicated a 2.4 degree increase in temperature rise on pre-industrial levels. That there is a real sense of urgency. Don't we need to act very, very quickly? Sonya, what's your take on that one?
Yeah, I think it's very, very sobering, that statistic. But if we don't do something today and move to these new technologies, as we know, the technologies do exist. So it would be great if some of the energy companies would increase their investment in renewables. And we need their infrastructure. Companies like ours need their infrastructure to be able to roll out. And I think that's where government, large corporations coming together can work really, really effectively. But those stats are real, and they will affect our children and our children's children if we don't make change happen by 2030. It is very scary when you actually start understanding sea level rises, mass migration. This is real and it's happening. It's happening now. So yes, the government really need to act, but I think also corporations, everyone needs to act. Individuals need to act.
Yeah, I mean, we all like to talk about numbers, measurement, the statistics, but there's only one number that really counts, and that's that warming measurement, isn't it? Duncan, what's your take on that piece?
I completely agree. I think we need to act now. The announcement on the temperature piece today is terrifying, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. We are putting in place, we're building the infrastructure that will support these new technologies. The problem is the investment and that is required to do it on the scale that we need to do quickly isn't there. There was a point that Charlie made earlier on that was really interesting that I wanted to pick up on around how a lot of these new technologies are still relatively small, and a lot of them in the market, like myself and Sonya's business, we're small startups that don't have a lot of cash in the bank. So we're not entirely attractive to the big traditional hedge funds and pension group investments. And that's the big business that we need the support from, and that support from the government to say, well, actually, we need to do more, we need to do it quicker. We've got the skills, we've got the resources, we've got the technology. We just need to really push the investment in this infrastructure.
A slightly more positive number. Last week on the Finance and Investment Day, $130 trillion worth of investment was promised to the decarbonisation sector. Charlie, I know you do a lot of work at EY, channeling funds of capital, advising on the channeling of funds of capital. Do you have some reassuring words for Duncan here on those investment flows?
Well, I mean, start at the beginning of this conversation in terms of how concerning is this, and I think everyone's in the same position. We need to be moving quicker. I think just picking up on this real challenge that, I mean, to give an example, that for every $1 billion that is taken out of one large oil or carbon heavy project, where the returns are known, the cash flows known, and the returns are relatively visible, to redeploy that into green projects, you're probably slicing that up into 100 tranches, which is significantly harder to manage, higher risk and lower and more uncertain returns. Now, that's the reality of capital transition. So it's less an issue of raw dry powder, which we have significant amounts, and I think the announcements were positive. Ultimately, it comes down to investors being willing to accept lower returns during the transition period. That then has a sequence of knock-on effects in terms of things like pensions. So again, we've made some encouraging first steps, but I think it's the consequences of that transition we've got to try and push through as quickly as possible. There's clearly greater will now than there probably was 3 weeks ago. So again, I'd take some encouragement, but is it fast enough at the moment? Absolutely not.
And do you think that investors, picking up on Charlie's point, should have a new set of metrics looking at, environmental, social and governance criteria in their decision making with real meaning and real weight rather than just pure profit?
I think the word real is very tricky to actually understand there. I think I agree with Charlie. The complexities attached with something like this really, in at least the short term, you're really not going to see some real kind of shifts happening there. There's going to be a lot of lip service, and that's probably not bad actually, because you got to start somewhere, right? But eventually, as I said earlier, so you got to look at your entire stakeholder set here and really attach outcome-based metrics to everyone, including the investor, including the financiers, including the users. The moment you do that, then you're going to really give purpose and a defined kind of outcome they all need to work towards. And that will, whether happy or not, whether the implications are lesser profit or not, they will have no other choice but to abide with that, okay? Now that's a bit, dictatorial, and it doesn't need to be rolled out like that, but there has to be a higher buy-in created in terms of the shift that need to take place. And then they have to be monitored and executed. So that we still have to see. So not yet real, but it's started, and that's a good step. But the question is, Is it, do we just wait for these technologies to happen? Probably, I don't think so. That's the answer. I think we need to fast track this.
Yeah, I think, Aman, just picking up on that, I mean, there's genuinely some encouragement. If you look at the investment policies of some of the large global infra funds, and particularly the Canadian pension funds, where they're now coming out very, very clearly with investment criteria that are very helpful. But the issue still is the availability of large-scale projects into which to deploy the capital. And this is where government de-risking of strike price for renewable outputs over a 30-year period can play a role. So I think the policies and the principles are starting to shift. But the thing we really have to accelerate is scale deployable projects into which that capital can be directed. I think there's an increasing overall recognition that you're trading off lower short-term returns for an absolute crisis 10 years down the line. So I think that reality is dawning. We've just got to get the project side accelerated as fast as possible.
So we only have a few minutes left. So just to wrap up, I'd like to ask you all if there are any ideas that you've heard from your fellow panelists that particularly inspire you, that give you some sense of optimism that this rate of change, that this de-risking of investment can deliver. Duncan, maybe over to you on this one. Anything you've heard that inspires you from this conversation?
I think it is reassuring. Charlie indicates around particularly, large funds like the Canadian Pension Fund, that there are now criteria in there. Again, I think there's probably a wider conversation about that short-term return versus, if we don't do it now, what's the long-term impact? It kind of comes down to that key metric again. If everything's being measured on that single metric of what that goal on the 2.4 today, or the parts per million, you can then suddenly break it down to a lot of lead versus lag measures in all different industries. But have I heard anything today that's made me think we can definitely do it? Yeah, I think we've got the skills. I think we're having the dialogue. I think the resources and the willingness is there. I think it just comes to the last point that Charlie made. We just have to do this at scale, and we have to do it really, really quickly.
So, Marcel, you're arguably the company here that is most capable of delivering at scale. What ideas have you heard that give you some sense of optimism?
Well, honestly, I think there was not much that I heard that was new. I mean, it's quite amazing how big the consensus is of what is needed, and that is more frustrating for me. More or less, if you see that there are tons of paper in the meantime, there are tons of initiatives like Clean Skies for Tomorrow with a clear mandate, or more or less a paper that was handed over to the EU saying this is how you can become carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040. So we all know what to do, but it's not happening, and that is a bit the frustrating part here. So I'm not really optimistic. I'm more bit frustrated. I can only add that when it comes to large companies, I think the forwarding industry is enabling already carbon emission avoidance or even net zero carbon transportation. So, for example, today we launched that each shipment that we are quoting to customers has the option now to offer or to fly with SAF, so sustainable aviation fuel, thus avoiding any carbon emissions. So it's there. So the solution is there. We just need to scale this up, and we need to get governments to subsidize SAF, plus to pump more money into technology and to, more or less give security for risk investors that there is a certain demand in 10 years from now for synthetic fuel, for example.
If we had a little bit more time, I'd like to have explored the consumer education piece to add some of those levers to drive change. Sonya, what have you heard that perhaps gives you a little bit more optimism?
So I think we're a bit further on the line than people realise. There are people using hydrogen, green hydrogen, experimenting with e-fuels, and that just needs to be ramped up a lot faster. So for instance, our company, we are not using electrolyzers to make green hydrogen, and we feel we can bring it in 30% more efficiently than the market. So at the minute, it's about £3 per kilo for green hydrogen. We feel we can do it around £2 per kilo. But in the States, they're wanting to get it down to between $1, $1.50, which we feel is really difficult to do that. So there are companies like ours who are powering ahead, and companies, doing your vertical takeoff. What an amazing world that we're living in with these new technologies. I think government are putting the funding in behind. And I think COP26 has certainly opened the eyes of some of the large corporates and energy companies to look at companies like ours as well. So I feel very positive. I think, if I feel by 2030 we will make a dent. Will we hit 1.5? I don't know, but I think we will make a dent on that target.
And Charlie, any ideas that you've heard in this discussion that inspire you?
Well, I kind of agree with Marcel. Everyone's violently agreeing. I think it's now a question of really taking the momentum out of this and moving forward. As I said, I'm as positive as I think we realistically can be. But I think, frankly, and speaking from a personal point of view, all of us active in this area have now got a real personal responsibility over the next 2 to 3 years to do everything we possibly can within the remits of our own organizations. And I get a real sense that everyone I talk to who's active in this area is now personally committed to doing something. Yeah, this isn't someone else's activity. Yeah, we talk about government, but this is up to all of us as consumers to make choices. And we're all in privileged positions because we work in industries and sectors where we can actually make a difference. So I come out of this with a bit of a personal mandate and marching order to try and make a difference. And from that point of view, that's encouraging, I think.
Aman, some closing words from you, please.
I have to say, Duncan spoke about urban airport and the infrastructure focus, the ecosystem focus that is there. And for me, that is the key kind of opportunity for us. And that's the positive message that we can take in and around what's happening around the COP26 kind of initiatives there. Because unless we approach it from an ecosystem perspective and find a solution which is really at heart of it, net zero in design, we are not going to achieve these targets. I think there's a lot of progress that has happened, a lot of announcement by Airbus, Eurovia, etc., which are really positive. And I absolutely agree. I think by 2030, we are going to make a dent. What the size of that dent is going to be is yet to be established. I have a feeling that we are going to be able to cross the set targets that we have already set up here. And that's because what Charlie said, everyone that we are talking to is almost committed to it. They're a bit passionate about it. They're talking with end in mind. So I think overall, there is a higher degree of optimism this time around than previously, so where there was a lot more talk than action.
Well, we entered this panel knowing that international travel was a huge challenge, and that huge challenge is certainly going to be a huge opportunity, and let's hope that opportunity is actioned at pace, certainly the pace that we need to bring that big overall figure of emissions down. So thank you very much indeed to our panel, and thank you very much indeed for everyone joining us on the first day of the inaugural 2021 Decarbonisation Summit. This was a day of vital conversations, but also under the hood, some powerful business engagement to help deliver the solutions that we so badly need to see. And there will be an ongoing social media conversation with the sharing of the content that we've created today with our partners, SSE Energy Solutions. So thank you very much indeed for everyone who joined us today. Tomorrow we will return for 5 more dynamic panels that answer some of the key questions around decarbonisation. Thank you very much indeed.